Hello all, welcome back to our channel Lingua and Literature. Today's topic is Plato's objection to poetry. As a moralist, Plato disapproves of poetry because according to him, poetry is immoral. A poem for Plato is a collection of copies of the ideas or forms. His opinion has been outlined in his dialogues and the Republic. According to Plato, poetry tends to arouse emotions, so the poet is not fit to be a good citizen. The moralistic approach believes that literature is morally good or has a capacity to influence people so as to make them morally better. Plato thought that bad and evil influences of literature should be kept away from the young generation during their formative years. Plato defends philosophy, that is, he supports philosophy. His purpose is to demonstrate the practical superiority of philosophy over poetry. As a philosopher, he disapproves of poem because it is based in falsehood. He is of the view that philosophy is better than poetry because a philosopher deals with idea or truth, whereas a poet deals with what appears to him or the illusion. He believed that the truth of philosophy was more important than the pleasure of poetry. Plato thus attacks poetry and drama on moral grounds. He says poetry is not conducive to social morality. A poet tells lies about gods, and great heroes who are descended from the gods are represented as corrupt, dishonest, and subject to all faults and vices of common humanity. Works of poets like Homer must not be prescribed for school study. Drama is even more harmful because dramatists and poets appeals to the baser instincts of men, their love of the sensational and the melodramatic. We can note that Plato condemns poetry on intellectual, emotional, and moral grounds and demonstrates its usefulness and its corrupting influences. He condemns the poets because they feed and water the passions instead of drying them. Passion in the sense emotions. So according to Plato, poetry should not be emotions, it should be intellectual, it should be philosophical. So thus he condemns poetry on three grounds: poetic inspiration, the emotional appeal of poetry, its non-moral character. So first let's look at poetic inspiration. According to Plato, the poet writes not because he has thought long over, but because he is inspired. It is spontaneous overflow or a sudden outpouring of the soul. No one can rely on such sudden outpourings. It might have certain profound truth, but it should be suspected to the test of reason. Then only it will be acceptable. Otherwise, they are not safe guides. So they can't be substitutes to philosophy, which is guided by the cool deliberation or reasoning. Poetry, on the other hand, is created by the impulse of moment, so it cannot make a better citizen or a nation. Okay, next let's see about the emotional appeal of poetry. Plato says that poetry appeals to the emotions and not to the reasons. Its pictures of life are therefore misleading. Poetry is the product of inspiration, hence it cannot be safeguarded as reason. Plato illustrates this with reference to the tragic poetry. In tragedy, there is much weeping and wailing. This moves the heart of the spectators. It is harmful in its effects too. If we let our own pity grow on watching the grief of others, it will not be easy to restrain it in the case of our own sufferings. So poetry feeds the passions and let them rule us, which means according to Plato, poetry creates emotions and these emotions controls us by ruling. Now let's see about its non-moral character. Poetry, according to Plato, lacks concern with morality. It treats both virtue and vice alike. Virtue often comes to grief in literature. Many evil characters are happy and many virtuous men are seen unhappy. It is seen that wickedness is profitable and that honest dealing is harmful to oneself. Their portraits of gods and heroes are also objectionable. Gods are presented as unjust or revengeful or guilty, and heroes are full of pride, anger, grief, and so on. Such literature corrupted both the citizen and the state. So now let's see about Plato's objection to poetry on education, philosophical and moral view of point. First let's see his objection to poetry in view of education. In Book 2 of Plato's The Republic, he condemns poetry as fostering evil habits and vices in children. Homer's epics were part of studies. Heroes of epics were not examples of sound or ideal morality. They were lusty, cunning, and cruel. Even gods were no better. Thus, he objected on the ground that poetry does not cultivate good habits among children. So now let's see about his objection from philosophical point of view. Book 10 of his work The Republic, he says that poetry does not lead to but drives us away from the realization of the ultimate reality, that is the truth. Plato says that philosophy is better than poetry because philosophy deals with the idea and poetry is twice removed from that original idea. Thus, he says, the imitator or maker of the image knows nothing of true existence, he knows appearance only. Thus, he also adds, the imitative art is an inferior who marries an inferior and has inferior offspring. Next, let's move on to his final objection, that is from moral view of point. Here, Plato says that poetry waters and nourishes the baser impulses of men, that is emotional, sentimental, and sorrowful. He also adds that poetry strengthens feelings and impairs the reasons, and we already know that it creates passions, and these emotions and passions allows us to rule. So through all this point of view, we can conclude that according to Plato, poetry must be philosophical, intellectual, and it should be connected with truth and not with emotions or passions. So now let's see why Plato objected to poetry. Before we pass on any judgment, we should not forget to keep in view the time in which he lived. During his time, there was political instability, education was in sorry state, Homer was part of studies, and Homer's epics were misrepresented and misinterpreted. Women were regarded inferior human beings. Slavery was widespread. Best time of Greek literature was over. Corruption and degeneration in literature arose. Confusion prevailed in all spheres of life, such as intellectual, moral, political, and education. Thus, in Plato's time, the poets added fuel to the fire. He looked at poets as breeders of falsehood and poetry as mother of lies. The chief reasons for his objection to poetry were: it is not ethical because it promotes undesirable passions. It is not philosophical because it does not provide true knowledge. It is not pragmatic because it is inferior to the practical arts and therefore has no educational value. These were the reasons for Plato's objection to poetry. That's all about today's topic. To get updates, please subscribe to our channel Lingo and Literature. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.